Welcome back. So we're going to be talking about the three fundamental races of mankind and the principle of geographic contiguity. So as I continue on reading verbatim, again, this is something we're going to continue reading verbatim because there's so much of information that Ra'um Nefer Amen put into this. I don't want to emphasize or leave anything out. So if we put the variations and admixtures aside, then we find that the races of mankind are the white, the black, and the yellow, red, oriental, which includes the American Indian. When we trace these people back to the late prehistoric and early historic times, we find that each of these people reside in separate geographic locations. For example, the oriental in the northeasternmost part of the Asia, and the later America, and Eurasian white, and in the northwesternmost part of Asia and northern Europe. And the blacks occupying from the southwestern parts of Europe, western and central Asia, and all of Africa. Now, within each of these three great geographic divisions of the world, we find in the late prehistoric and early historical times that nations speaking related languages with similar racial characteristics and culture patterns, okay? So we could say that the Supreme Being made men with certain differences and put them in different parts of the globe. Western historians have used these concepts to discover the kinship and origin of their people after thousands of years of separation. When it comes to the great black civilization, it is a different story. Western historians are always postulating an unproven and unprovable geographic origin from them in areas where they have had no kin. For example, they seek the origins of the Sumerians in Eastern Asia, when the people who most closely share their racial and cultural characteristics reside in Africa. They do the same for ancient Egyptians. The exact location of the origin of many of the great white nations of antiquity are unknown, yet two historians have proposed an origin for them in America or Africa. It is such a natural reflex to search for their origins and the geographic location where all whites have been known to inhabit since prehistoric times. We must also take note of the fact that planets and animals of related characteristics has been thus distributed around the earth as well. Trick number 2 has been to postulate that the precocious development of the Comatian, ancient Egyptian, culture was either the product of an invading master white Semitic race, or the Shemeshu Hiru, or the result of the bleeding of the white and the black races. First of all, it is important to realize that at work it is the racist offshot ideas of Darwinism. To wit, clearly, blacks, a primitive race, could not solely or primarily be responsible for such a culture, period. Rather than pass in deserved silence the allegations that a white race was responsible for Comatian civilization, wholly or in part, let's look at some facts. Number 1, no facts has ever been given to support the allegation showing that the concept is born solely from the unwillingness to accept the fact that the blacks could have created such civilization. 2, the alleged master white race has no other achievement, previous or otherwise. They left no traces of civilization anywhere else. And at the time when the alleged dynastic race is supposed to have come to Kemet and placed himself under the military leadership of Comatian leader Narmer, Eurasia was still in the Paleolithic stage, the hunter-gathering around the 3500 BC, while all of North America was in the Neolithic, and early agricultural stage, and Kemet has passed into the historical stage. The proposal that they came from Arabia is even worse. And at the time, Arabia was mostly inhabited by blacks who were less developed regarding civilization. So thus we were to believe that a people who achieved nothing at home came and established civilization in an entirely more advanced area and then vanished, leaving no remains of themselves. No bones, no cultural likeness, no items of themselves in paintings, sculptures, etc. Now, in reality, the Shimshu Haru, the people who historians have tried to equate with their hypothetical race, are the very blacks that are called Nubians. So what can you say of the historians who ignore the fact that all the nations in the northeastern section of Africa at the time were far ahead of Eurasia in the technologies that were chiefly responsible for the development of Kemet, and who preferred to invent a Eurasia cause for the development of Cometian civilization? An important part of this argument rests on the false theory that racial contact is a chief cause for the advancement of civilization. Now let's look at some more facts. The Haiku's occupation of Kemet for 150 years contributed nothing to the progress of Cometian culture. In fact, all the historians are in agreement that it is retarded it. So, did the occupation of Kemet by the Persians, Greeks, and Romans? In fact, the contact of whites with the Cometians' culture ended in the destruction of the latter, cultural and physically. So I cannot imagine one single historian who would not agree that the civilization of ancient Egypt, Sumer, Indus Valley, and Kush would far surpass anything the present world had not been destroyed by whites. It is a very interesting subject to speculate upon, though. The same retardation, arrest of progress, and eventually destruction occurred with the mingling of white culture with that of the Sumer, Canaan, Phoenician, Indus Valley. The theory has only held true in the reverse direction, as Western men greatly benefited from the contact with the ancient black civilizations. The point of this detailed look at this issue is not merely to prove historians wrong, but to emphasize the real source of civilization. Today's leading psychologists will tell you that when you have to come up with the solution of a problem for which there are no precedents, it is to the right side of the brain that you have to make your appeal. It is in charge of invention and creativity. The progress of Western science is more one of technological advancement of variation than of invention without precedents. Precedents. Now, to this day, no one has explained how the Chinese were able to come so far in science in the end of World War II. They have done in less than 40 years what normally takes over 150 years for Europeans. So we will see that the Chinese is an eminently right-sided culture. The ability of the great black nations to invent civilization and make such rapid progress must be seen as the result of their advanced techniques for using the right side of the brain. In fact, Kemet outdistanced Sumer, Canaan, the Indus Valley, and Phoenicia, because it adhered closely to the right side methodically of thinking, in which hieroglyphic systems plays a pivotal role. So the third ruse used in historians is an insult to their intelligence. It is what concerns their play with the word Ham. In the Old Testament, the races of mankind are classified as descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. While it is accepted by all the Japheth correspondents to the European and Northern Asiatics and Shem to the Shemites, there is a great deal of, well, you would have to call it idiot talk regarding Ham. Now, since there are no Oriental people depicted in the paintings and sculptures of Kemet, Greece, and the Mesopotamian nations, it is not far-fetched to conclude that the compilers of the Old Testaments were not familiar with this race, especially given the fact that they were located so far away. Now, this explains why the Orientals were not included among the races of mankind. Now, we know that the biblical compilers were very well acquainted with black people. After all, their ancestors were heavily intermarried with them, to say the least. Now, if the Semites correspond to Shem, the European, to Japheth, then where do we assign the blacks? Still don't know? Well, let's modify that question a little bit. If Ham does not correspond to Shemites or the Europeans or the Orientals, to whom does it correspond? The Old Testament compilers assigned Ham to ancient Egypt. Canaan, Cush, Ethiopia, and Punt, a nation that was located at the Horn of Africa, modern-day Somaliland. The ancient Egyptians claimed that it was the location of their origin, hence made regular pilgrimages to it. They called it Ta-Neter, land of God. Now, incidentally, the people of this area dressed in the same fashion as that of the Egyptians, and their men styled their beard in the same manner as the false bearded worn by the Cometians of the pharaohs. Now, these similarities clearly support the Cometians' claim that they descended not only from this area, but from these people. And through Cush, Ethiopia, Ham relates to the indigenous original inhabitants of Arabia and Sumer, which last was referred to as Nimrod, the ruler of Babel, Erech, and Akkad, in the land of Shinir, or Sumer, according to the biblical Table of Nations. Hebrew scholars claim that etymology, and the meaning of the word Ham is uncertain. We will see that this is the case with many of the most important words in the Hebrew language, and why. Now, the word is actually pronounced Cam, and it is spelled with the Gutra H, Keith, Kim. The popular pronunciation with the inspired H is a product of sloppy scholasticism. It is a loan word from the ancient Egyptian language where it means black, Kem. And the ancient Egyptians called the country Kemet, land of the blacks, and themselves Kamu, black people. This can explain why all the races the black has been referred to since ancient times by the color of their skin, negros. From the Latin negro, meaning black. If it were natural to do so, we would find that the other people would be referred to in a similar manner. Instead, all other nations, people of antiquity, are referred to by the name of their nation. White people called blacks black because the Cometian people started the whole thing by thus calling themselves. Their paintings and sculptures of themselves testify to the fact that they are of the black Negro race, and so are the words of the foreign eyewitness. Herodotus, an eminent Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BC, describes the Cometian people as having black skin and woolly hair. In External Egypt, Pierre Monnier describes the Cometians' ancient Egyptians as the following. They have clearly defined features, prominent eyes, unusual, large, almost flat noses, thickish lips, and somewhat low foreheads. Such were without exception the kings of Egypt at the time of the Old Kingdom. Many individuals presented the same features, for instance, Ranefer, who lived during the 5th dynasty, of whom there are 2 statues in the Cairo Museum. It is interesting to note that the Monnier fails to sum up these characteristics as black, especially when he has seen the statue of the priest Ra-Nefer, which is indisputably that of so-called Negro. So desperate have historians become that in their attempts to identify Ham with another race, perhaps Martians will qualify. They have classified most Nilotic blacks like the Messiah and the Somali as non-Negroes, yet they are Hamitic. Interestingly, the same historians label the same black as Negroes when they are referring to them during the Egyptian historical period. So how come today they are of the so-called non-black Hamitic or Nilotic race, note a race unknown by scientists? The answer is to be seen in the fact that more and more evidence is pouring and showing that the ancient Egyptians and the contemporary Negroes of the Sudan, the Gala, the Bari, the Dinka, the Nudaru, etc., are northeastern Africa and are linguistically related. To show that Kemet is ethically and culturally related to Africa, Frankfurt wrote of several of the early African prehistoric cultures of the Sudan south of Egypt. In the First Great Civilization on page 46, Jakita Hawks wrote, "Together they represent the African substratum of the pharaonic civilization, the material counterpart of the affinities between the ancient Egyptians and modern Hamitic languages, of the physical resemblance between the ancient Egyptians and the modern Hamites, and the remarkable similarities in mentality between these two groups, which makes it possible to understand ancient Egypt customs and beliefs by reference to the modern Hamitic analogies." Now we'll go on to speak more on that. So the symposium on the peopling of ancient Egypt and the deciphering of Meroitic script. This was 28th January 1974, published in 1978 by the UNESCO. All right, so Theophile Abinga introduced the irrefutable evidence that the ancient Egyptian language and its descendant, the Coptic language, used by the Coptic Church and related to the African languages. Words reinforced and laughed as Ham was supposed to have done. I trans their version of the story to the Hittites because the Hebrew people originated ethically from a mixture of Hittites, Amorites, and blacks. Of the Semitic language, which were written down long before that of the Indo-Europeans, and thus stabilized. So, with that being said, the Europeans and the stabilized have yielded no common parent before they were separated. So, as it has been done for Indo-European, before commenting on this, let's take a note of the fact that while the languages of the Indo-European, Africans, and Orientals numbers over 100 each, with hundreds of dialects, there are, with generous concessions, only 3 Semitic languages, with no more than 4 dialects, and they are the Akkadian, and its dialect is Babylon and Assyrian, 2, the Aramaic, and its dialect is Hebrew, and 3, Arabic. The reason for this is that the Semitic languages are really variants of essentially black languages of Canaan and Phoenicia. Therefore, any attempt to find the original Semitic language must be led back to Canaan and Phoenicia. In fact, this study has been done, but it is suppressed by the mere silence on one hand, and on the other hand, by passing Canaan and Phoenicia as Semites, which are the whites. Now, we will see that in their mood of thinking and therefore in their cultural expression, they share everything in common with the rest of Africa. The conclusion is inescapable. There is such reality as a Semitic language. What we call Semitic languages are really dialectical variants of African Hamitic languages. Let's quote a highly regarded Jewish author and professor of sociology and University of Toronto, The Ancient Judaism by Irving M. Zelitin. On page 19, we read concerning Israel's debate to Canaanite. Canaanite influence on ancient Israel. What the Ra Shamra evidence shows beyond doubt is that the Canaanites did in fact have an influence upon the culture of Israel. The only question is not whether such an influence existed, but rather its nature and how and when it occurred. Now, beginning with the biblical literature, it is evident that they are perfected and polished writings attesting to the existence of literary traditions going back many centuries. Now, these traditions are neither Mesopotamian nor Egyptian, but Canaanite. Just as the Hebrew language developed from Canaanite, so Hebrew literature built on the Canaanite literary traditions, which had crystallized long before the Israelites had became people. Now, Israel took over norms and techniques of literary expressions that were established in the most ancient Canaanite dialects. We find first of all many words common to both the Geographic and biblical literatures. Rosh Hed, Shanyim, heaven, Artis, earth or land, are just a few examples. And on page 23, we read, many contemporary biblical scholars continue to take for granted that the Israelites borrowed from the Canaanites almost everything essential: language, elements of religion, and knowledge of agriculture. This occurred, scholars believed, as a result of the well-known phenomenon of cultural assimilation, denying the historicity of the book of Joshua, where it related that a large number of Canaanite cities-states were destroyed together with their inhabitants. These scholars argued that the Joshua narratives are largely fictional. The Israelites did not conquer Canaan in a series of wars. They rather settled gradually in a sparsely populated high hill country, far from the Canaanite centers of powers. Emphasis on is mine. The above material was quoted to show how Western historians have played down and have sought to conceal the Canaanite origin of Jewish culture. The reason, it is obvious: the Canaanites were black. The book of Joshua is very important because it contains the fulfillment of Yahweh's promise to give to the descendants of Abraham the land of the Canaanites. Yet evacuations conducted at Tel Es-Sultan in 1951 through 1957 by the British School of Archaeology totally disproves the historicity of a Jewish conquest of Canaan. The disposed destruction of the walled city of Jericho, leading to the downfall of Canaan, was no more than a creation of priests writing down the exile about 700 years after the alleged event. The only findings of the dig was a group of walled towns dating way before the Israelites period. Some even dated back to 6,800 BC.